My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 31 years old. 5 years ago, I walked into Caldwell and Associates with nothing but a laptop bag and a quiet belief that hard work would always speak for itself. I believed that if you showed up, stayed when others left, and fixed what others ignored, the right people would eventually notice. I was right, just not in the way I expected. The moment that changed everything wasn't a private conversation behind closed doors. It happened in front of everyone, in a room full of people who had already decided I didn't matter. And the person who set it in motion wasn't a friend. It was the man who stood before my entire team and told them I was just temporary, as if 5 years of my life could be erased with 2 casual words. What he didn't know was that those 2 words were the match that lit a fire he could not put out. The Tuesday started the way most Tuesdays did. I arrived before anyone else. The hallway lights were still on their overnight setting, that dim, yellowish glow that made the carpet look older than it was. I liked those early minutes. The silence felt honest. I made coffee in the small kitchen off the second floor and sat at my desk with a cup I barely touched before people began filing in. I had worked at Caldwell and Associates for 5 years. 5 years of arriving early and staying late. 5 years of covering for colleagues, solving problems that landed on no one's job description, and keeping the kind of quiet that serious people keep, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are watching. My desk sat near the east window. From there, I could see the whole floor. I noticed things. I always had. When my manager, Neil Boateng, called everyone into the open conference area for what he called a quick alignment check, I noticed the way he adjusted his cuffs before he began. A small thing. But Neil always did that when he'd rehearse something. I put my coffee down. I should have known then. But some part of me still hoped I was wrong. The morning light came in flat and gray through the windows. 14 people gathered. Some standing, some seated, some leaning against the glass partition. There was the low hum of people who don't yet know they are about to witness something. I sat with my hands in my lap and waited. Neil stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed, and that particular smile he wore when he wanted to look relaxed, but wasn't. He started the way he always started, talking about momentum, about the company entering a critical phase, about the need to cut what he called legacy drag. Nobody asked what legacy drag meant. That was the thing about Neil's meetings. His term sounded important enough that asking for clarity felt like admitting weakness. Then he shifted to staffing. He talked about some roles growing beyond their original purpose, about right-sizing the core team. And then he looked directly at me. Not at the group. At me. Daniel is still here in a temporary capacity, he said. His original contract was a support role. We're evaluating whether his function has a long-term fit with where we're heading. The room went quiet. The particular silence of people who don't know whether to react or pretend nothing happened. I felt heat rise in my face. I kept my expression flat. My jaw stayed still. My hands stayed in my lap. Neil moved on immediately, as if he hadn't just handed me a public humiliation. He began speaking about an important investor meeting scheduled for that same afternoon. I sat there and breathed, because I knew something Neil didn't. I had known it for 3 years, sitting in a fireproof folder in my apartment, waiting patiently for exactly this kind of moment. And the afternoon was going to prove everything. The laughter came from somewhere to my left. Not loud, just the awkward sound that escapes people when they don't know if something is funny or terrible, and they choose funny because terrible feels too heavy. I didn't look to see who it was. What mattered was the silence from people who knew better. My colleague Priya Ose, who had worked alongside me on 3 major client projects, stared at the table. Kwame Asante, a senior analyst, cleared his throat and looked at his phone. 2 others exchanged a glance that said everything. The glance of people who know something is wrong but won't say so. Neil wrapped up the meeting in under 10 minutes and walked back to his office with the energy of someone who had just handled a chore. People drifted to their desks without the usual post-meeting chatter. Priya appeared at my desk 3 minutes later, keeping her voice low. "That was unnecessary," she said. "It was," I agreed. "You're not going to say anything?" I looked out the window at the gray February sky, then back at my screen. "Not right now," I said. She studied me for a moment, clearly expecting anger. Most people expect anger in those moments because anger is the obvious response. But anger is also loud, and loud people announce their moves before they make them. I had learned a long time ago that patience and weakness look exactly the same from the outside. I had learned to be comfortable with that confusion because I knew what was sitting in a folder on my desktop. And in a few hours, so would everyone else in that building. To understand what happened that Thursday, you need to go back further, to my second year at Caldwell, when the company nearly collapsed, and no one in leadership wanted to admit how bad it was. I felt the trouble before I could name it. The tightening of conversations, the sudden caution in executive hallways, the way expense reports began getting questioned for the first time in years. It was a Thursday in November when I first saw how serious things were. I had stayed late to finish a quarterly operations report that nobody had assigned me, but that I knew was 3 weeks overdue. While pulling numbers from a shared drive, I found a cost projection file saved in the wrong folder. It wasn't password protected. I opened it thinking it connected to my report. What I found instead was a forecast showing the company had roughly 4 months of operating runway before it would need to either cut a third of its staff or lose its anchor client, a logistics company called Ardmore Freight Solutions that made up nearly 40% of Caldwell's annual revenue. I sat with that file open for a long time. I could have closed it, finished my report, and gone home. Nobody would have known. Instead, I started reading, then thinking, then writing. By 2 in the morning, I had the outline of something that could actually work. Not a miracle. A real practical restructuring plan that could save the client relationship while reducing the company's dangerous dependency on it. I saved the document, turned off my monitor, and drove home through empty streets. The next morning, I walked into the CEO's office and asked for 15 minutes. The CEO at the time was a man named George Caldwell, the founder's son. He knew the company the way people know the house they grew up in, not always consciously, but deeply. His assistant, a sharp woman named Anita, ran his calendar like a controlled experiment. Dropping in was not something employees did. But I had something George needed more than he needed his schedule protected. I told Anita it was about Ardmore. She looked at me for a moment, then picked up her phone. George gave me 20 minutes. I walked him through the plan in plain language. No unnecessary terms, no padding. I showed him the risk, explained the restructuring path, and outlined a renegotiation strategy that would allow Caldwell to reduce its Ardmore dependency over 18 months without alarming the client. George listened without interrupting. He asked 3 questions, sharp and specific, the kind that tell you someone has understood everything you said. At the end of the 20 minutes, he leaned back and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from a senior person before. Not exactly admiration, more like recalibration. Like he was meeting someone he'd underestimated entirely. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 14 months, I said. He nodded slowly. "Keep this between us for now," he said. "I need to verify the numbers. But I want you involved in whatever comes next." I nodded and walked out. I had no idea how long whatever comes next would take to arrive. But I had put something in motion that morning that would take years to fully land. Over the 6 weeks that followed, I worked quietly with George and the 2 senior partners on implementing the plan. The restructuring was careful and deliberate. Ardmore never suspected anything was shifting beneath the surface. They walked into a renegotiation that looked like a service upgrade and signed a new 3-year contract. At the 18-month mark, Ardmore's share of Caldwell's total revenue had dropped from 40% to 22.4%, exactly as the plan projected. When it was done, George called me in. He had a folder on his desk, the kind with a metal clasp slightly thicker than a standard presentation document. He slid it across to me. Inside was an internal agreement, signed by George as CEO and witnessed by both senior partners. It formally recognized my role in the Ardmore restructuring and outlined a long-term strategic function I would hold within the company regardless of departmental changes. There was also a clause I read 3 times. It stated that any significant employment action involving my role, termination, reduction, or reclassification, required board-level review and could not be executed by any single department manager. George had given me something almost no one at my level had. He had put it in writing that I could not simply be erased. I took the document home that night, made 2 copies, and stored the original in a fireproof folder. I told no one. Not then. Not for 3 years after. I simply went back to work the next morning as if nothing had changed. Because, for everyone watching, nothing had. After Ardmore settled, life at Caldwell returned to its usual rhythm. I kept doing what I had always done, showing up, staying when needed, solving problems that fell through the cracks between other people's job descriptions. George trusted me quietly. He would stop by my desk sometimes to ask my opinion on operational questions. Never publicly. Never in a way that drew attention to our dynamic. I think he understood that visible favoritism would have made my position harder. People would have resented me or tried to use me as a back channel to reach him. The quiet arrangement served us both. I trained 2 new analysts who joined the following year. I rewrote the onboarding documentation that had sat outdated for years. I helped repair a damaged relationship with a mid-sized client named Brentfield Group after a billing error nearly pushed them to leave. None of this appeared on a presentation slide anywhere. None of it earned me a mention at the annual staff dinner. But Kwame noticed. Priya noticed. And Anita, who had seen more of the company's real history than most, noticed too. The people who pay attention always notice. They just don't always have the power to do something about it until the right moment arrives. I kept that in mind during the years that followed. I kept it in mind when things were frustrating. I kept it in mind when credit went somewhere it didn't belong, and I said nothing. The moment was still coming. I just needed to still be standing when it did. George retired 2.5 years after the Ardmore plan. His departure came with a short internal email and a small gathering on the 2nd floor on a Friday afternoon. I shook his hand at the end of it. He held on for an extra beat. "The document is still valid," he said quietly. "The board has a copy. Make sure you remember that." I nodded. He left. The new CEO was brought in from outside, a man named Stuart Hale. Efficient, numbers-driven, with a track record of expanding regional companies through aggressive cost management. Not unkind, but distant. He ran the company like something he'd acquired rather than something he'd built. Under Stuart, departments got reorganized. Roles got reclassified. Faces changed. 8 months ago, Neil Boateng arrived as Director of Operations, my department. He came with a reputation for streamlining teams, which in practice meant replacing people with those loyal to him rather than to the institution. In our first one-on-one, Neil asked good questions and remembered my answers. He appeared engaged, even respectful. But I noticed the way he looked at me during that conversation. Not hostile exactly. More like someone measuring furniture to see if it fit the new room he was building. I went home that evening, opened the fireproof folder, and read through the agreement once. Still signed. Still valid. Every clause exactly as George had written it. I placed it back carefully and reminded myself that patience is not the same as passivity. Neil was going to make his move eventually. I just needed to be ready when he did. Over the following 6 months, Neil worked to reframe my position. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you couldn't point to without sounding paranoid. My name disappeared from project update emails, even when I'd done the core work. Neil started copying junior staff on communications, where I had previously been the primary contact. In team presentations, my contributions were folded into phrases like, "The team pulled this together." No individual credit attached. He was quietly building a version of the department's history, where I had always been peripheral. Kwame noticed first. He mentioned it during a walk to the parking structure one evening. "He's erasing you," Kwame said. "Slowly, but that's what's happening." "I know," I said. "You're just going to let it happen?" I looked at him. Kwame thought in short timelines. It was both his strength and his limitation. "I'm going to let him keep going," I said, "until he puts himself somewhere he can't recover from." Kwame was quiet for a moment. You know something, he said. Not a question. I know several things, I said. We reached the parking structure. I thanked him and got in my car. I drove home thinking about the moment that was still coming. Not that specific Tuesday. I didn't know the date yet. But I knew Neil's pattern was too aggressive to stay quiet for long. He would eventually overreach in a setting too public to recover from. I had the documents. I had the patience. I had the truth. All I needed was the room. The rumor started the week before the investor meeting. Priya told me first in the small kitchen table area people used when they didn't want to be seen talking. They're interviewing for your role, she said. What did you hear specifically? Neil submitted a staffing request 2 weeks ago. Entry-level classification, lower salary band. They're calling it a role restructure. I let that settle. An entry-level reclassification wasn't just about replacing me. It was about downgrading the entire function, so the gap between what I had contributed and what the new position required would be invisible on paper. Neil wasn't only trying to remove me. He was trying to rewrite the room, so my removal looked like a logical step. Are you worried? Priya asked. No, I said. You should be at least a little worried, Daniel. There's a difference between being worried and being unprepared, I said. I'm not unprepared. She studied my face, deciding whether to believe me. I went back to my desk. 2 days before the investor session, a message appeared on the internal company platform from a number I didn't recognize. It was short. Are you planning to attend Thursday's investor session? I believe you should be there. W.O. I stared at those initials for a long moment. I knew exactly who W.O. was, and his presence at this meeting changed everything I had been building toward. I typed back, yes, I'll be there. His reply came within minutes. Good. Bring your records. That was all. I opened my files and began printing. W.O. stood for Walter Obie. I hadn't heard that name in over 2 years. Walter Obie was the founding partner of Obie Vance Capital, a mid-size investment firm connected to Caldwell since before I joined. His firm had stepped back from active involvement around the time George retired. But Walter had been present during the early Ardmore conversations. George had brought him in quietly as an outside validator. Walter had reviewed my plan, asked pointed questions, and afterward stopped me in the hallway with words I had not forgotten. That kind of thinking is rare in people your age, he had said. Or any age, honestly. I had thanked him and thought little more about it. Until now. I pulled together everything. The original Ardmore plan. The cost projections I had found in that mislabeled folder. The restructuring timeline. Performance data from the 3 years following implementation, showing client revenue had diversified exactly as projected. And from a secure cloud folder, I pulled up the scanned copy of the agreement George had signed. I read it once more. Every clause. Every signature. Then I printed what I needed, organized it flat inside a standard black presentation folder so it wouldn't draw attention, and set it on my desk for Thursday. The next morning, Neil walked past my desk without looking at me and told me I would be attending the investor meeting in a support capacity to take notes. Of course, I said. He moved on. He had no idea that the meeting he had spent months preparing to own had already shifted in a direction he wasn't tracking. The room was about to change shape, and I would be ready when it did. Neil told 3 different people that Thursday's investor meeting was going to be his defining moment at Caldwell. I know because all 3 mentioned it to me in slightly different ways over the 2 days between the Tuesday announcement and the Thursday session. Kwame heard it in the hallway outside Stewart's office. Neil telling Stewart the new operational direction he'd built would impress the incoming investors. Priya heard it differently. Neil in a side conversation with a junior manager, saying the meeting would clarify the team's direction and remove any lingering confusion about who was driving strategy. And then there was Anita, George's former assistant, still at Caldwell and now supporting Stewart directly. She found me Wednesday morning at the coffee station. Neil told the board coordinator you'd be there as administrative backup, she said quietly. Not as a contributor. He was specific about it. I poured my coffee. How are you doing, Anita? I asked. She gave a careful smile. I pulled the full attendee list for Thursday. Walter Obie's firm is sending 3 representatives. Walter will be there personally. I looked at her. I thought you'd want to know, she said. Thank you, I said. She nodded and walked away without another word. I thought about Neil in his office, cuffs adjusted, rehearsing his talking points. He had spent 8 months carefully positioning himself. He had the narrative arranged. He had the room set in his favor. But he had done all of this without once asking why George Caldwell, a careful, deliberate man, had written a legal protection clause around a 22-year-old analyst's employment. That incuriosity was his real mistake. Thursday arrived cold and clear. I was at my desk by 7:15. The investor meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon in the large third-floor conference room, the one with the glass wall overlooking reception and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the afternoon light. I had my folder ready, not visibly thick. I had organized the documents so they sat flat inside a standard black cover. Nothing that would draw attention. I dressed the same way I always dressed, dark trousers, clean button-down. Clothes that say you belong in the room without announcing it. By noon, the third floor hummed with preparation energy. Chairs rolling, water glasses arranged, the particular nervous hum of a building expecting people it wants to impress. At 1:45, I took the stairs and walked in. Neil was already there, talking to Stuart Hale at the head of the table. When he saw me, something small moved through his expression, a quick recalibration. He pointed me to a chair along the side wall, away from the main table. You can sit there. You'll have the laptop for notes. Of course, I said. I placed my folder beside the laptop and opened a blank document. At 1:58, the door opened. 3 people entered in professional coats. Then Walter Obie walked through behind them. He was older than I remembered, more gray at the temples, slower in his step. But his eyes were the same, sharp and patient, the eyes of someone who has learned to see past performance to what is actually happening underneath. His gaze scanned the room. It landed on me and stopped. He nodded once. I nodded back. The first 20 minutes went the way Neil had planned. Stuart opened with an overview of the company's position, revenue, client base, expansion targets. Neil followed with a presentation on operational changes he had introduced, framed as innovations rather than reactions. The 3 Obie Vance representatives listened without reacting much. One took notes. Another occasionally glanced at documents. Walter sat at the center of their side of the table, hands folded, watching everything. I typed notes as I'd been told, accurate and complete, because that is what was asked of me, and I do what is asked fully. But I was also watching the room. Neil performed well in the technical sense. His slides were clean, his language confident, his answers to anticipated questions rehearsed. He looked exactly like the right person to be standing where he was standing. That is the thing about polished presentations. They are convincing until the room changes shape. The room changed shape when Walter leaned forward slightly and said, in a quiet voice that somehow carried across the entire table, "Before we continue, I'd like to ask about the Ardmore restructuring. Can someone walk me through the original recovery strategy? I want to understand how the current operational model connects to that foundation." Neil smiled, the prepared smile. "Absolutely," he said. "The Ardmore situation is a great example of the kind of strategic thinking we apply here." "I'd like to hear it from Daniel, actually," Walter said. He did not look at Neil when he said it. He looked at me. The room went quiet. Neil's smile stayed on his face 1 beat longer than it should have. Every head in the room turned toward me, including Neil's, including Stuart's. I closed the blank notes document. I placed my hands flat on the table, beside my folder. I took one breath, not a visible one, just an internal settling that I had learned to do in difficult moments. The Ardmore situation began in the company's 4th year, I said. At that point, Ardmore Freight Solutions represented roughly 40% of Caldwell's annual revenue. The structural risk was significant, deep dependency on a single client relationship that a standard stress analysis would immediately flag. I spoke clearly and without rushing. I did not look at Neil. A cost projection from that November showed approximately 4 months of operating runway before either a major staffing cut or a client crisis became unavoidable. The issue wasn't Ardmore's satisfaction. They were a happy client. The issue was overdependence. Walter nodded. The recovery plan had 2 parts. First, a renegotiation approach that reframed the relationship as an expanded partnership, giving Ardmore genuine additional value, while giving Caldwell the flexibility to protect its margins. Second, a parallel diversification path to reduce Ardmore's share of total revenue from 40% to a target of 22% over 18 months. And the result? Walter asked. 22.4% at the 18-month mark. Ardmore signed a new 3-year contract. 4 additional midsize clients came on board in the same period. The room was absolutely still. Who designed that plan? Walter asked. He was looking at me. He already knew the answer to his own question. I did, I said. A pause settled over the room. For seconds. Long enough for something to shift permanently. Stuart Hale shifted in his seat with an expression somewhere between surprise and careful blankness. The look of a man not showing his hand until he understands what game is being played. Neil was very still. The smile was completely gone. He had the look of someone who has just realized the ground beneath him is softer than he thought. One of the Obie Vance representatives, a younger man in a navy jacket, shot Walter a quick glance. Walter didn't return it. He kept his eyes on me. How old were you when you built that plan? Walter asked. 23, I said. Someone at the table exhaled quietly. And in what capacity are you currently with the company? Walter asked. His tone was neutral. But the question wasn't neutral. He was asking it for the room, not for himself. I let one B pass. As of Tuesday morning's team meeting, I said, I was described by my department director as being here in a temporary capacity. The words landed the way a flat stone lands on still water. Impact small. Ripple wide. Walter looked at Neil for the first time since asking his question. A long, measured look. Neil opened his mouth. I think there may have been some miscommunication about Daniel's role, he started. I think we should look at the documentation, Walter said. His voice was still quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that ends conversations rather than invites them. Walter reached into his leather folder and produced a single sheet. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Stuart Hale. My firm has been monitoring Caldwell's structural development since the Ardmore period, he said. We stepped back from active investment at that time, but never fully disengaged. The reason we remained interested was specifically because of the quality of thinking that plan represented. He looked at Stuart. When we received your invitation to discuss renewed investment, we ran a standard evaluation. Part of that evaluation was checking whether the person responsible for the most significant strategic contribution in the company's recent history was still here, and in what capacity. Stuart looked at the sheet. His expression tightened. Our evaluation flagged a discrepancy. Walter continued. The operational role Daniel holds appeared to have been reclassified in recent months, from a functional leadership position to what looks, on paper, like a junior support role. He paused. That raised a significant concern for our team. One of his colleagues turned a laptop toward the room. On the screen was a timeline, a side-by-side comparison of role descriptions before and after Neil's arrival. Neil was looking at the table. We would like to understand, Walter said, his voice still even, how a company arrives at describing the architect of its most successful strategic period as temporary. He looked at Stuart, then Neil, then back at Stuart, waiting with the unhurried patience of someone who has asked a question he fully intends to have answered. Stuart turned to Neil. The room waited. Neil recovered quickly. I'll give him that. He straightened in his chair, recalibrated his expression to something resembling composure, and spoke in the measured tone of someone who has navigated difficult boardrooms before. Daniel's historical contributions are genuinely valued, he said. But companies evolve. The skills that serve an organization at one stage don't always translate to the next. My role has been to align the team with where Caldwell needs to go, not just where it has been. Walter looked at him steadily. That's a reasonable philosophy, he said, provided the people being moved aside genuinely lack the skills required for the next stage. He paused. Based on what I've heard in the last 10 minutes, I'm not at all convinced that's what's happening here. With respect, Neil said, you've heard a description of work done several years ago. The landscape has changed significantly. Has it? Walter gestured to his colleague, who turned the laptop fully to face the room. The screen showed a performance chart, revenue trends, client diversification percentages, operational efficiency metrics mapped carefully across 5 years. These are Caldwell's performance indicators since the Ardmore Plan was implemented, Walter said. The upward trajectory continues on exactly the same path as the original plan projected. That strongly suggests the strategic thinking behind it is still very much functioning, and has been consistently all along. He looked at Neil. Your recent staffing request suggests you were actively working to ensure that it wouldn't be. A board representative who had been silent the entire meeting looked up from her notepad. I'd like to see the original employment agreement, she said. The one from the George Caldwell period. She was looking directly at me. I opened my folder. The document sat on top, printed cleanly from the scanned copy I had preserved for 3 years. I placed it at the center of the table. Stewart reached for it first. He read the opening paragraph, then the clause outlining the board oversight requirement. His expression didn't change, but he went very still. The board representative, her name, I would later learn, was Adiz Naji, extended her hand. Stewart passed it over. She read slowly, turning to the second page. This is authenticated? She asked. It wasn't quite a question. The original is notarized, I said. George Caldwell signed it as CEO. Both senior partners at the time co-signed. One of them is still with the company. I placed a second document on the table, the notarized copy, stamped and dated. Adiz read the third paragraph carefully. This clause requires board-level review before any employment action affecting this role, including reclassification. Yes, I said. She looked at Stewart. Was a board review conducted before the reclassification request was submitted? Stewart looked at Neil. Neil looked at the table. The silence that followed was its own answer, long enough for everyone in the room to understand exactly what it meant. Kwame, who had quietly entered the room and taken a seat along the back wall, I had noticed him slip in but said nothing, let out a slow, controlled breath. Adiz placed the document down with deliberate steadiness. This is a significant governance concern, she said. I understand, Stewart said quietly. The next few minutes moved with the speed of rooms that have just had their foundation shifted. Adiz spoke quietly with her colleagues. Walter sat with hands folded, watching with the patience of someone who knows that rushing a room like this only extends it. Stewart asked if the meeting could pause for 15 minutes. Walter agreed. People moved. The Obi-Vance team stepped to the far side of the room. Stewart stepped into the hallway with Adiz. Neil remained at the table, looking at nothing. I stayed in my seat. Kwame crossed over and sat beside me. You knew this whole time, he said. I had the document, I said. I didn't know when it would matter. I just kept it. He shook his head slowly. 5 years, he said. 5 years of watching you work, and I still didn't know the full story. It wasn't my story to tell until it became necessary, I said. Across the room, Priya had appeared near the glass wall, close enough to hear, far enough to not technically be inside the room. Word was already moving through the floor below. I could feel it in the way the building's usual sounds had gone quiet. The hush of a building full of people who know something significant is happening one floor above them. Neil stood up at some point and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room. I watched him stand there and felt nothing specific. Not triumph. Not anger. Just a clean, quiet clarity I had been carrying toward this moment for 8 months. The pause ended. Stewart and Adiz returned. Stewart sat at the head of the table with the expression of someone who has made a decision and intends to deliver it plainly. I owe this team an explanation, he said. And I owe Daniel a direct acknowledgement. He turned to me. I was not aware of the full terms of the agreement from George Caldwell's tenure. That is my oversight failure, not anyone else's. The document was in the board's records. I should have reviewed it before any operational restructuring was discussed. I didn't. He paused. The staffing request submitted by Neil was not reviewed against that agreement before it was processed. That failure has legal implications we'll need to address internally. But the more pressing issue is a leadership one, and I want to address it now. He looked at Neil. The characterization of Daniel's role made publicly on Tuesday morning was inaccurate. It did not reflect his documented history, his contractual standing, or his actual function within this company. The room was quiet. I am instructing HR to freeze the reclassification request immediately, pending a full governance review. And I am asking this team to understand that the version of history that has been presented over recent months, about who contributed what and in what capacity, needs to be formally corrected. He looked at Walter. I appreciate your firm's diligence in raising this before a decision was made. Walter nodded once. That is why we conduct evaluations, he said. The room breathed again. Not fully. There was still too much unresolved for that, but the direction had shifted clearly. You could feel it in the way people adjusted their posture. Adiz and Stewart spent the next 40 minutes reviewing documents in the smaller conference room next door. I was asked to stay available and provide any additional records I had. I provided everything: the original projections, the restructuring timeline, the performance data covering 3 years post-implementation. During that time, Neil sat alone at the main conference table. I was aware of him in the way you're aware of weather changing, not always looking directly at it, but knowing its direction. Kwame stayed in the room. He sat with his notebook open, pretending to write. He was there as a witness, and he knew it. Priya came in once, asked if I needed anything, and stayed near the door. Anita appeared at one point with water. She set a glass beside me with a small nod. I thanked her quietly. By the time Stewart and Adiz returned, the afternoon light through the windows had shifted to that warmer, more angled tone that February gives you in the hour before dark. Close to 4 o'clock, the Obivance team gathered again on their side of the table. Stewart sat at the head. I sat in the same chair I'd occupied since 2 in the afternoon, the sidewall seat, the one Neil had assigned me for note-taking. Walter looked at me. Daniel, he said, we'd like to hear from you. Not about the past. About what this company needs going forward. He gestured toward the empty chair at the main table. Please sit here, he said. I picked up my folder. I moved to the main table. I sat down. The chair felt different from the side wall. Everything felt different. I spoke for about 12 minutes. I had no formal presentation, no slides, no prepared deck. But I had spent 5 years watching this company from the inside, and I didn't need slides to say what I knew. I talked about the 3 areas where Caldwell was structurally weakest: client feedback systems with no consistent process, internal knowledge that lived in individuals rather than documentation, and a communication gap between what operations understood and what leadership communicated externally. Not complaints. Observations, each with a specific example attached. I talked about the Ardmore plan not as a past achievement, but as a model. Proof that the company had the capacity to solve complex problems early, when someone was looking at the right data at the right time. Then I talked about what it would take to turn that capacity into a consistent system rather than a lucky accident. Walter asked 3 questions. His colleagues asked 2 more. Stewart asked 1. They were all sharp, specific, and forward-looking. The kind of questions asked by people genuinely processing what they've heard rather than waiting for you to finish. When I was done, the room held a moment of quiet. Then Walter turned to his colleagues. A brief look passed between them, readable only to someone watching carefully. The look of people who have found what they came for. I think we've seen enough for today, Walter said. We'd like to schedule a follow-up session next week to discuss the terms of a renewed investment relationship. He paused, with the understanding that our continued interest depends on the company reflecting its actual strengths in its leadership structure. He looked at Stewart, then at me. All eyes in the room turned to where Neil was sitting. The investors left at 4:23. Walter shook Stuart's hand at the door. He shook mine too, firm and brief. "We'll be in touch," he said. Then he was gone. The room didn't immediately relax. Stuart remained at the head of the table. Adiz, who had stayed, kept her seat. Junior managers, who had filtered in during the afternoon, stood along the back walls. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Stuart looked directly at Neil. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. Calm. The calm of someone who no longer needs to be anything other than direct. Neil stood. He straightened his jacket slowly. He walked toward the door, without looking at anyone. He didn't look at me. I didn't need him to. The temptation in a moment like that is to feel triumphant. To let the satisfaction of being finally seen fill the air around you like warmth. I understood the pull. I had imagined this moment in various forms for a long time. But the actual feeling was quieter, cleaner than I expected. It felt like setting down something heavy that I had been carrying. For so long, I had stopped noticing the weight. Only in the moment of putting it down do you feel how much your arms had been working. I stayed at the main table as the room slowly emptied. Kwame was still there. Priya was still there. Anita stood in the doorway. None of us spoke for a moment. Then Kwame leaned back in his chair and said very quietly, 5 years. 5 years, I agreed. By 5 o'clock, the floor knew. Not every detail. Details take time to travel accurately. But the broad shape of what had happened was already moving through the building. In small groups, near the coffee station. In the quiet between desks of people who had been waiting since Tuesday to understand how this would end. I walked back to my desk on the second floor and sat down. The view through the east window was the same. The carpet was the same. The coffee from this morning was cold in the mug beside my monitor. Priya sat in the chair beside my desk, the same chair from 3 days ago, after Tuesday's meeting. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Tired," I said. "And clear." She nodded. "They're going to offer you something formal," she said. "Stuart will have to, not just because of the document, but because of the investors." Walter made it clear. "I know," I said. "Are you going to take it?" I looked at the window. The late afternoon sky had gone that deep gray blue that February does in the last hour before dark. Not beautiful exactly, but honest. The sky the way it actually is. "Depends on what it is," I said. "And how they ask." Priya smiled. The kind that reaches the corners of the eyes. "You're still you," she said. "I was always me," I said. "Some people just didn't notice." She stood, squeezed my shoulder once, and returned to her desk. I turned to my screen and began writing up the notes from the investor meeting. Accurate and complete. Because that was what had been asked of me. And I do what is asked fully. Stuart Hale called me into his office at 8:45 the following morning. Anita had sent the calendar invite the night before, just a time and a room, no description. The way serious conversations get scheduled. His office was functional rather than impressive. A clean desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with numbers that had been there long enough to start fading. He stood when I came in, which I noticed. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I'll be direct," he said. "You deserve that after what happened." "I appreciate it," I said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Neil has been placed on administrative leave, pending an HR review of the reclassification request and the governance process. That will take its course. I won't get ahead of the outcome, but I want you to know the review is serious." I nodded. "The board has been fully briefed on the George Caldwell agreement. It is valid and enforceable. There will be no further employment actions regarding your role without a full board review. That process is formally reinstated." He paused. "I'm also formally rescinding the temporary characterization that was applied to your position on Tuesday. It was inaccurate, and it should not have been allowed to stand, even for the 4 days it did." He looked at me directly. "The Obie Vance firm has indicated serious investment interest. Walter Obie specifically requested, in writing, that any partnership discussion include a structural conversation about how this company develops and retains its strategic thinkers going forward." He leaned forward slightly, I'd like you to lead that conversation, not participate. Let it. I didn't answer immediately. Stuart had offered something real, not a title for managing a problem, not a sideways gesture meant to quiet an uncomfortable situation. He was asking me to step into a function that matched what I had been doing informally for years. But I had thought about this moment long enough to know I needed it structured correctly, or it would not hold. I have conditions, I said. Stuart's expression didn't change. Tell me. The role needs to be clearly defined, not just in title, but in scope and authority, specifically around operational strategy and cross-departmental access. I'm not interested in a position that looks like leadership but doesn't actually function that way. Agreed, he said. I want an open process for correcting how this department's history has been represented internally. Not a memo. A genuine accounting within the team of what the actual record shows. Kwame, Priya, and others who notice things over the years. They deserve to work somewhere the truth is acknowledged. Stuart nodded. That's fair. And I want a seat in the Obi Vance investment conversations. As a participant, not background. He met my eyes. Done, he said. I extended my hand across the desk. He shook it, the kind of handshake that means something has been genuinely decided rather than agreed to for the sake of the moment. I walked back down the stairs to the second floor. My desk was exactly where I had left it. The window was the same. The view hadn't changed. But the gap between what I was and what I was being asked to become had finally, after 5 years, closed. The following week, Stuart called a full team meeting. All departments. Third floor conference room. He stood at the front without slides. He acknowledged the previous week's events in plain, specific language. He said that inaccurate characterizations of a colleague's standing had been stated publicly, and that this had been wrong. He did not use soft language about miscommunication. He was direct. A pattern of misrepresentation had occurred and had been allowed to continue too long. He acknowledged that the company had benefited from work that had not been properly attributed. He named the Ardmore plan specifically. He named me. The room had different reactions. Some people looked down. Some looked at me with genuine remorse. The ones who had been there longest, who had known something was being distorted but stayed silent, sat with the particular stillness of people facing what their silence had permitted. I didn't perform any emotion for the room. I sat near the center of the table and listened. When Stuart finished, he asked if anyone wanted to add anything. Kwame raised his hand. He said he wanted the team to understand that what had happened wasn't only a management error. It was a culture problem. A habit of rewarding the performance of leadership over the substance of it. He said he spoke for several people on the floor when he said they were glad it had been addressed and were committed to not letting it happen again. A long quiet followed. Then Priya started clapping. Slowly at first. Others joined. It wasn't triumphant applause. It was the sound of a room that had collectively decided to acknowledge something it needed to face. That kind of sound is rare. And when you hear it, you know something real has shifted. 3 weeks after the investor meeting, I sat across from Walter Obi in a conference room on the 12th floor of Obi Vance Capital's downtown offices. The view from there was entirely different from my east-facing window at Caldwell. Glass and steel, and the city spread wide under a winter sky that was almost, but not quite blue. Walter had 2 colleagues with him. I had Stuart and Adiz on my side of the table. We had been working for nearly 2 hours through the framework of a renewed investment relationship and what it would mean for Caldwell's next growth phase. At one point, Walter set his pen down. "Can I ask you something off the agenda?" he said. "Of course," I said. "When did you know that things would work themselves out the way they did?" I thought about the Tuesday morning meeting. Neil adjusting his cuffs. The laughter from my left. My hand staying still in my lap. "I didn't know for certain," I said. "I knew I had built something real, and I had documented it carefully. And I knew reality has a way of reasserting itself eventually. But the timing, I couldn't control that." "Were you scared?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Not scared," I said. "Tired sometimes. Tired of invisible work staying invisible. But scared, no. Because I knew what I had done. and no one can erase what is properly recorded. Walter looked at me for a moment. George told me about you, he said. Years ago. He said you were the most valuable person in that building. I nodded. He gave me the tools to protect that, I said. I just made sure I kept them. I am 31 years old, and I am still at Caldwell and Associates. Not the same Caldwell I walked into 5 years ago. Something is shifting there. The way things shift when a building settles onto a foundation that was always solid, but never trusted. My title is Director of Strategic Operations. Real access, real scope, real authority. Not the appearance of leadership. The actual thing. Neil's review concluded 6 weeks after Thursday. He is no longer with the company. I had no part in that outcome beyond telling the truth. The process did the rest. Kwame was promoted to senior analyst. He told me with a dry humor he keeps for things that are both absurd and resolved. Priya leads client retention now. Excellent at it. I always knew she would be. Anita is still there, still running the calendar with precise authority. On my first full day in the new role, she placed a coffee on my desk, said simply, "It's about time," and walked away. The Obivance investment closed in March. Ambitious targets, grounded enough to actually work rather than just look good. I still arrive early. I still like the quiet hallway before the building wakes up. When I sit at my desk now, I don't feel invisible. I don't feel like someone waiting for the right moment. I am the moment. 5 years of quiet work. 5 years of showing up when leaving was easier. 5 years of building something real in the space between other people's noise. They called me temporary. They were wrong about the word. What they meant was patient. And patience, real patience, backed by documented truth and steady hands, is not weakness. It is a long game. And I had been playing it from the very beginning.